Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nathan Dorr, and I'm the curator of the Draper Natural History Museum here at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. Our assistant curator, Corey Anko, is handling everything from the back end of technology. So thank you so much, Corey. Thank you all for joining us today for our first hybrid lunchtime expedition. We're so happy to have everybody here in person here at the center, to have a group of folks joining us virtually via Zoom webinar. And for those of us who will be viewing this presentation later when it's posted to our YouTube channel. We're especially happy to be joined today by our speaker, Professor Bob Keiter. Support for the Draper's Lunchtime Expedition series has been made possible through Sage Creek Ranch and through the Nancy Carroll Draper Charitable Foundation. These sponsors help make these programs possible, and we're also grateful to you for joining us for your attendance, your feedback, and your support. We do record our lunchtime expeditions and post them to our Draper YouTube channel. So if you've missed any of our previous speakers, you can find their presentations there. For those of you who are joining virtually, please feel free to submit your questions using Zoom's chat or Q&A feature. We'll relay your questions to our speaker at the end of the presentation. As I mentioned, today we are joined by Professor Bob Keiter. Professor Keiter is the Wallace Stegner Professor of Law, University Distinguished Professor, and founding director of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land, Resources, and Environment at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. Bob holds a Juris Doctor degree with honors from Northwestern University and a BA degree with honors from Washington University. He has taught at the University of Wyoming, Boston College, and Southwestern University, and served as Senior Fulbright Scholar at Kathmandu, Nepal. His books include To Conserve Unimpaired, The Evolution of the National Park Idea, Keeping Faith with Nature, Ecosystems, Democracy, and America's Public Lands, The Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, Redefining America's Wilderness Heritage, and the Wyoming State Constitution. He has served on the boards of the National Park Conservation Association, the Rocky Mountain Mineral Law Foundation, the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, Sonoran Institute, and the University of Utah's Institute for Clean and Secure Energy. And today, he's here joining us to explore law, science, and the pursuit of ecosystem management in an iconic landscape. Please help me welcome our September Lunchtime Expedition speaker, Professor Bob Keiter.
Well, thank you, Nathan. I'm honored to be here. Let me thank all of you in the audience. I really appreciate the interest in this important topic, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I'd also like to extend my thanks to the Draper Natural History Museum, the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, Rebecca West, director of the center, and to my friend Rebecca Watson, who has been instrumental in getting me here and who also serves on one of the boards here for the Buffalo Bill Center. I'm also, I should say, honored to be back in the state of Wyoming. I spent 15 years at the University of Wyoming College of Law in Laramie, really sort of cut my teeth on public land and natural resource issues there, and in particular, while there, got deeply interested in the Greater Yellowstone region, the concept of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and trying to understand what was happening here roughly 30 years ago. And I've now had the opportunity to come back 30 years later to explore what has happened and to try to understand why. I should say at the outset that I produced a very lengthy law journal article that this talk is based upon. It is, if you will, sort of a sequel, if I can put it that way, to earlier studies that I was involved with. 30 years ago, as I mentioned, I did extensive research on the emerging concept of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Two publications emerged from that addressed the GYE concept and the emerging notion of ecosystem management, what they meant for natural resources management, and the potential impact that they might have. So let me begin, and I apologize for reading a bit in order to set the stage, but I think it's the most efficient way for me to set the stage, and then we'll move into what's been going on. But 30 years ago, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem concept and ecosystem management surfaced as key to preserving this iconic, legally fragmented region's public lands and wildlife in the face of mounting development pressures. Yellowstone's grizzly bears were in sharp decline and wolves were absent, while bison and elk management controversies festered. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem's national forest lands were subject to extensive logging, energy leasing, and other commercial activities that cumulatively threatened the region's ecological integrity. In the face of extreme jurisdictional complexity and a strong commitment to agency discretion, here think the Park Service and Forest Service in particular, a high-profile federal vision effort to improve and better coordinate federal resource management practices surfaced. And in a draft vision, so-called vision document, called for, quote, a world-class model, end quote, of ecosystem management on, quote, a landscape where natural processes are operating with little hindrance on a grand scale. That vision process, however, as some of you may be aware or recall, ended up cratering under pretty intense local political pressure. But since then, much has changed in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. My earlier study endorsed the idea of a Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and suggested, quote, the ecosystem concept provides the fundamental premise for regional management and thus brings a compelling new vision to the ongoing debate over the future of the public domain. A primary goal of ecosystem management, it argued, was to promote meaningful coordination between the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service in order to safeguard Greater Yellowstone's unique wildlife populations and other natural attributes, which collectively represented the area's cultural importance and economic future. Ecosystem management, as generally defined, seeks to promote science-driven, coordinated, and adaptive resource management efforts to conserve biodiversity and natural processes at an ecologically appropriate scale, while also providing for public participation and supporting economically and socially sustainable communities. It differs considerably from traditional resource management policy for the public lands, which tends to focus or has focused on boundaries, single resources, commodity productions, targets, agency expertise, and certainty. So what I've done currently is to take basically a sort of 30-year study of what has happened, why it has happened, the issues then and now. My research involved extensive interviews and document reviews. My interviewees included some of the early pioneers of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and ecosystem management concept, agency leaders, today's advocates, and I benefited greatly from their insights and observations that now they provided. So to begin, let me set the stage with talking about the area, the legal framework, the science that has evolved here, the institutional players, etc. This area the greater Yellowstone ecosystem has frequently been described as a wonderland, an ecological wonderland. By most accounts today, it constitutes or covers roughly 20 million acres in 3 states, 2 national parks at the core of the GYE, 5 national forests. There were 7 30 years ago. There's been combination within the Forest Service of individual forests. Extensive wilderness areas, particularly adjacent to the national parks. 3 national wildlife refuges, headwaters of 3 major river systems. It's still an ecologically integrated and relatively natural landscape that includes functioning natural processes, now all of the original species. But 30 years ago, there was no mention, at least in with the people I worked with and spoke with, of climate change, and little mention of human development pressures on private lands. So the human dimension in the GYE. By roughly 30 years ago, we saw the beginnings, I think, or at least some did, of the emergence of a new West that has continued over the past 30 years. This concept of a new West is frequently described in these terms as a shift away from the Old West heritage of utilitarian extraction toward a new culture of natural amenity-minded transplants influenced by new ideas about nature and motivated to both enjoy and protect its natural amenities. I draw that quote from Justin Farrell in his book about the battle over Yellowstone. The consequences of this gradual transition here in the GYE are quite evident. Today, there are something in the neighborhood of 180 non-governmental organizations involved in conservation efforts throughout the regions. And that includes a environmental law firm office, Earth Justice in Bozeman, any number of state and local and national land trusts. As a result of this emerging and changing economic priorities, we see a number of hotspots today in the GYE. Bozeman and Jackson would be classic examples of that. The net result, more pressures on the public lands in the area as well as the private lands, the loss of open space. Think Teton Valley, Idaho, or Paradise Valley, Montana, as one of the astute individuals that I interviewed put it. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem front country is now filled up, and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem back country is becoming increasingly crowded, in his terms. The legal institutional framework in the GYE, I try to characterize it here with this somewhat wordy slide. Number of federal agencies, most of you are familiar with them: Park Service, Forest Service. BLM has a role often on the perimeter of the GYE, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. An array of federal laws prevail across the ecosystem, perhaps prominently the National Parks Organic Act inside the parks, the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act and National Forest Management Act on the national forests. The Wilderness Act certainly plays a role, in particular with regard to some of the controversies I'll be talking about. The Endangered Species Act and National Environmental Policy Act have played a major role, as I'll note when we talk about the wilderness, the roadless area rule has come into play here. The agencies have evolved. They're much more diverse today, both in terms of disciplinary background of the people working in them, hydrologists, biologists, et cetera, not just timber folks in the Forest Service, for example, as well as both gender and ethnic diversity within the agency. We have experiments with new agency entities like the landscape conservation cooperatives that surfaced during the Obama administration. The Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee put in place between the Park Service and Forest Service back in the 60s, still in place and perhaps more active than ever, having hired an executive coordinator who is actively involved in trying to improve and facilitate coordination between the different agencies. 3 states, and that becomes particularly important to recognize the difficulties that presents in terms of addressing particularly wildlife controversies in the area. And state law plays a role today also. And that's particularly true when we look at wildlife management, zoning, and land use decisions. The result, legal and institutional complexity, and that in turn presents the challenge of how to manage wildlife and other transboundary resources or impacts in this complex legal setting that includes notable federal, and state tensions. I'll try to highlight that as we move along. Conservation science has evolved over the last 30 years. 30 years ago, the balance of nature metaphor was on the way out with recognition that ecosystems evolve in what is often referred to in scientific terms as a non-equilibrium fashion. Unpredictable change, certainly climate change has added to that in today's world. We are poised to enter, depending on who you talk to, the age of the Anthropocene, human-dominated world. The goal for conservation purposes today, as in the past, remains to conserve biodiversity, ecological integrity, and promote resilience. We've moved beyond the enclave strategy, just draw a line around an area and that will suffice to take care of the animals found there, to embrace a broader strategy that includes nature reserves, landscape scale planning, connectivity and corridors connecting these reserves and preserving the opportunity for animals to move, and the practice of adaptive management, that is responding, being facile enough to respond to the changes that are occurring on the land. Multi-jurisdictional coordination is recognized as quite critical, a question that has resurfaced as with adoption of wilderness concepts and Park Service policy, in particular of natural regulation, has become, do we today, particularly in the face of large-scale disturbances like climate change, need, or should we be thinking in terms of more active management strategies? Let me start with the parks. Just briefly, there have been a number of issues and remain a number of conservation issues within the 2 GYE parks. Many of those issues are tied back to the adoption in the late 60s, early 70s by Yellowstone as the leader and other parks of a natural regulation policy that, among other things, in essence, turned loose bison, wildfire, and ultimately restored wolves, all of which have potential implications not only within the park, but outside of the park. The snowmobile controversy in Yellowstone took up 15 to 20 years. It involved battling federal courts as to whether or not snowmobiles ought to continue to be allowed in the numbers that they had grown to within the park. And the question really hinged upon, should a national park like Yellowstone be a quiet winter refuge, or is it more properly regarded as an economic engine for gateway communities. Ultimately, after battling policies between the Clinton and the Bush administration, the Park Service managed to find a sweet spot that allows guided snowmobile trips and promotes more use of snow coaches today. Today's issue, many believe, hinges on the question of visitation numbers. Yellowstone, the last few years, minus the pandemic year, running in excess of 4 million visitors annually. Grand Teton approaching that, and the question becomes, is that too many? Should steps be taken to, if you will, control, limit, regulate visitation? A number of parks, in particular down where I'm currently based in Utah, indeed have taken that step. It's clear that the Park Service has that sort of authority, but it has historically been very reluctant to exercise that sort of authority. Political considerations emanating both from concessioners and gateway communities play a role in that. I should also mention that in Grand Teton National Park a few years ago, the Park Service surrendered jurisdiction to the state of Wyoming over inholdings. That has contributed to, excuse me, further jurisdictional complexity within the park and highlights some of the federal-state tensions in the area, not only on the national forests, but also with respect to the national parks. Moving to wildlife, one of the real symbols of the GYE is the grizzly bear, and for that animal as well as other wildlife within the GYE, boundaries are largely irrelevant. And to manage these animals effectively, some sort of coordinated management on an ecosystem basis makes sense. But there are differences in federal and state law regarding wildlife management, and those differences are based upon the jurisdictional boundaries that we've drawn on the map. Respecting the grizzly bear, it is the one principal, large, if you will, charismatic animal in the ecosystem that today, as it did back 30 years ago, falls under federal jurisdiction as a result of the Endangered Species Act. It was originally listed for federal protection in 1975, and that in short order gave rise to efforts to coordinate management to save a flagging bear population that had dipped down into the 100 or more bears in the ecosystem. Part of that decline attributed to the Park Service's decision to move to a natural regulation policy and close the garbage dumps where the bears had been feeding. This slide gives you a sort of overview history of some of the key legal political developments respecting grizzly bear recovery. I think important to note, the bear has been under federal protection almost throughout the entire 30-plus years that I'm, well, actually much more than that, years that I'm focused on here. And as a result of that, the states have not been involved in, directly involved in bear management. However, a recognition early on that it was necessary to involve both federal and state wildlife managers in the fate of the bear, and hence the establishment of an interagency grizzly bear committee and a Yellowstone ecosystem subcommittee here. A couple of delisting efforts that the courts have turned back, one in 2007, a second one just a few years ago. In doing so, some important points came out of the court decisions. The 2007 decision invoked concerns about the impact of climate change on whitebark pine seeds as a principal food source for the bear, and the long-term impact that a warming climate might have on that food source. It sent the Fish and Wildlife Service back to the drawing board. 10 years later, it emerged with another delisting rule, this time again as a result of litigation by conservation organizations. The courts found that the agencies had not complied with the Endangered Species Act, noting in particular the failure to take account of the impact of delisting the Yellowstone population of bears on other listed grizzly bear populations, notably the Northern Continental Divide Glacier area, as well as others further west there in the Cabinets and Selkirks and North Cascades National Park. In addition, the court decision highlighted the importance that the agencies initially had attached to genetic connectivity between the Yellowstone population and the glacier area population, and the failure of the agency to account for promoting that connectivity with its delisting decision. There also was a dispute over bear counting policies that were poised to change with a more or a less conservative counting method. We may well have something approaching 1,000 bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but the current counting method puts the population in the, roughly in the 700 bear range. What the grizzly bear recovery effort, I think, demonstrates in the broader sense is one, the power of the Endangered Species Act and the need for coordination and cooperation at the federal and state level. And related to that, there was a disturbing development following the 2017 delisting was the lack of consultation, particularly by the state of Wyoming, from a perspective that I understand, about hunting on Yellowstone National Park's boundary of bears. That's really one of the critical questions looking forward. That is, will hunting be allowed, and at what level once the states assume management, assuming that they do assume management here. I should note that the state of Wyoming consulted at some length with Grand Teton National Park during this delisting process. Wolf restoration, a major successful federal ecological restoration effort that took place despite considerable state resistance. Initially, delisting, that is moving the wolves out of endangered species protection to state management, generated a good deal of litigation and eventually congressional intervention to block any further litigation over the delisting effort. Net result is today we see state management of the wolves, including hunting seasons. Not well coordinated, however, with the national parks, where the wolves remain protected. Here, the presence of the wolf continues to be quite controversial. And this last set of legislative sessions, we saw the Montana and the Idaho legislatures pass bills that expanded hunting opportunities for wolves in both of the states. The lessons from the wolf restoration and delisting controversy, despite initial success in court, Congress had the final say. It was responding to powerful local coalitions of ranchers, hunters, and guides. And it also demonstrates an ongoing lack of sufficient coordination between the states and the national parks following delisting, something that remains critical to manage on an ecosystem basis. Moving on, the bison controversy has been with us for 30 or 40 years. Park Service management of its bison, particularly in Yellowstone, has evolved from basically treating them like wildlife to adoption of the natural regulation policy. The brucellosis wildlife disease surfaces in the 1980s as a problem. And we see the state of Montana deciding that bison really ought to be under the aegis of the state livestock rather than Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department. A great array of litigation early on that eventually led to the agencies coming together. I list them on the slide to adopt an interagency bison management plan in 2000. Basic elements of that plan are: one, bison moving out of the park are subject to being tested and potentially slaughtered if they test positive for the disease. Adaptive management is also an element of that plan. And that adaptive management over time has led to the relaxation of limits on bison being allowed outside of Yellowstone, north of the park by the state of Montana, but none and efforts afoot, but not yet complete, to revise that interagency bison management plan. About 10,000 bison, however, have been dispatched under the existing plan, and for all practical purposes, the state of Montana is dictating the bison's fate. I probably should also note the arrival of the National Academy of Science report in 2017 that concluded that the real threat going forward from brucellosis emanates from elk, not bison. I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. There is an emerging, at least partial and important solution to the bison problem, and that's the notion of the idea of transferring excess bison to Native American reservations. We all know that the bison was critical to the lifestyle of the Plains Indians and remains an important cultural icon for the tribes. Today, through the Fort Peck Tribal Bison Quarantine Facility, there's the opportunity, and it has been availed of, to transfer some bison. We're up to over 100 from Yellowstone's bison herds to the Fort Peck facility. The Fort Peck facility on the reservation there has in turn been transferring bison out to other Native American reservations. Montana still resists the transfer movement of bison, but with Native American tribes as sovereign entities cannot prevent them from exercising their sovereign authority in this way. It remains to be seen how this revised interagency bison management plan will work out. The lingering question here, do we manage Yellowstone's bison as wildlife or as domestic livestock? The problem really calls out for much better federal-state coordination. New scientific information has given us a lot more understanding of the role of our large ungulates in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and their migratory patterns. Using technology, we're better able to track and understand their migratory tendencies and to understand the degree to which to make their living annually they cross boundaries. The information that's coming out suggests that the size of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is much larger, at least when it comes to these species, than we previously understood. This is giving way to the related concept of landscape scale conservation. Interestingly, here we have an animal crossing boundaries, but there's, rather than political resistance, there's a great deal of political support within the ecosystem and the states to protect the necessary habitat and migration corridors. This is manifest in the Wyoming Migration Initiative, Montana's 2020 Wildlife Migration Strategy, the Western Governors Association, the Secretary of the Interior Zinke's order, USGS, Geological Survey, has now undertaken a corridor mapping initiative. One of the prominent scientists in understanding wildlife migration patterns here in the GYE, Arthur Middleton, a graduate of the University of Wyoming, where he earned his PhD in wildlife biology, says, as to the importance of these animals, quote, "The flow of elk in and out of Yellowstone sustains the entire ecosystem." A major accomplishment several years ago down outside of Grand Teton National Park was the official establishment of what's come to be called as the Path of the Pronghorn, which establishes and extends protection to, in essence, a migratory corridor. It was the result of a multi-agency coordinated effort to establish this corridor. Interestingly, it didn't require new law. It was done under the existing law and well could serve as a model for similar coordinated migratory corridor protection efforts. I should also note that the House of Representatives this term has passed a National Wildlife Corridors Protection Act. Its future in the Senate is debatable, but we see movement at that level as well as movement at the state level. The Path of the Pronghorn, which is illustrated on the slide, we see the, I can get the, I think I hit the wrong button here. I'm not getting, whoops, I'm hitting the wrong button. Let's see if I can get the pointer to come up. Okay, now I just did it. So much for my technological abilities. Okay. Need to get rid of, oops. How do I get rid of the side? Sorry, Nathan. Oop, one up, two up. There you go. Okay. Sorry, I won't try to use the pointer again. Apologies. At any rate, the map, the important point here is you can see the Path of the Pronghorn Corridor crossing from national parklands where they summer to higher elevations, across the Bridge of Teton National Forest, across private lands, here think conservation easements, and across the major highway connecting Pinedale and Jackson, down onto BLM lands, whereas I think most of us know there's a major oil field, Pinedale anticline activity going on, but the BLM set aside areas of critical environmental concern there to help to facilitate this migration. At any rate, a rather significant accomplishment and a potential model going forward for wildlife migration. One of the lingering issues where we see a lot of tension is over the presence of feeding grounds, state feeding grounds for elk here in Wyoming. It's the only one of the 3 GYE states that maintains winter feeding grounds. done because of the loss over time of habitat and migration opportunities, and to provide ranchers with protection of their hay here. It's an unnatural development for sure when we think in terms of the GYE as being a, if you will, a sort of a natural ecosystem. It promotes commingling among animals. It's an incubator for disease, brucellosis, but now also potentially chronic wasting disease. There have been efforts by the conservation community to try to close the feed grounds, but considerable resistance from local ranchers as well as hunters and guides. 14 of the 22 Wyoming feed grounds are located on federal lands, principally national forest lands. There was an important federal court decision 2 years ago that said that the Forest Service had erred under the National Environmental Policy Act when it granted a continuing permit for the state to occupy the Alkali Flats feed ground. At this point, that remains a point of contention, as does the whole feed ground issue. Importantly, in terms of thinking, in terms of an ecosystem and coordination, the state of Montana, in particular, has officially objected to Wyoming's feed grounds. It again demonstrates the lack of and need for interstate coordination in order to address wildlife issues, and not just interstate coordination, but also federal-state coordination. Now I'm going to shift gears again and move from wildlife to national forest management, a major concern 30 years ago. A lot of attention focused on the Targhee National Forest, which was in the midst of the largest timber sale ever in the lower 48. Significant overcutting in that area with major impacts on wildlife, including the federally protected grizzly bear. A number of court and administrative challenges to these sales succeeded, and we saw the Targhee in 1997 revise its timber plan, leading to a 90% reduction in the amount of timber harvest, the closure of the two major mills adjacent to the forest, and for all practical purposes, commercial timber activity across the GYE has dropped off dramatically. In Wyoming here, between 1976 and 2010, the number of timber mills went from 50 to 12, to give you an idea of the impact. Today, when we think of forest management and timber, let me make this point first. There was a slightly different concern on the Gallatin National Forest, north of the park. There you had lands originally owned by Louisiana Pacific and Big Sky, south of the Big Sky development, the result of the railroad era, checkerboarded lands that in prime wildlife habitat, high on and, well, from lower elevation to higher elevation on the Gallatin Range. Real concern about, one, the potential of large-scale logging on those checkerboarded private lands, and two, an even greater concern once the Big Sky Resort was in place of subdivision development occurring on those private lands. In order to avoid that, both the Forest Service and conservation organizations worked with Louisiana Pacific and ultimately made two major land exchanges that pushed all of that checkerboarded land into federal or public ownership. It's critical wildlife habitat north of the park. now, as a practical matter, most of the forest activity is focused on ecosystem restoration projects in order to seek to reduce the wildfire risk. Think drought, climate change, and past fire suppression policies, and the growing need to address what has come to be known as the WUI problem, which continues to grow and put private homes closer and closer to the perimeter of the national forests. So we're seeing ecological restoration replacing commercial timber harvesting. Oil and gas development 30 years ago was a major concern. A lot of litigation over leasing in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. But then as the Mideast oil crisis faded, prices went down, supply increased, development basically tamped down. In 2000, though, we saw a resurgence of energy needs, scarcity, and the Pinedale Anticline project area was proposed, and it now represents the third largest natural gas field in the United States, situated roughly southwest of Pinedale. Initial plans called for 700 well pads. That eventually was increased to 4,400 wells due to fracking and horizontal drilling technologies. The growth in well pads was not as great as the number of wells itself because of that technology. Efforts to block the project in court failed. That enabled large-scale industrialization on almost 200,000 acres of BLM land situated on the edge of the GYE. Significantly, the GYE National Forest largely escaped oil and gas development at that point in time. And then some interesting things began happening. In 2003, the Bridger Teton withdrew lands north of Jackson from oil and gas development. We've only seen in recent years a relatively modest drilling activity. Litigation more generally continues to swirl over leasing and oil and gas development focused on climate change and sage grouse. It hasn't yet had much impact in the GYE, but there really hasn't been much growth in the Pinedale Anticline area. But the development of that oil field in turn triggered concern over possible expansion of significant development in the Wyoming range, and it triggered a campaign to protect this area as too precious to drill. And a diverse coalition came together that eventually prompted Congress in 2009 to pass the Wyoming Legacy Act that led to the buyout of existing leases and withdrew forest lands from further leasing. What this suggests is an evolving local attitude toward the greater Yellowstone ecosystem as a, quote, special place. And this is, the fact that this occurred in Wyoming, I think, is particularly noteworthy given the state's dependence on energy as an economic engine. I should also note here close to home in Cody that roughly 8 years ago, the Shoshone National Forest revised its forest plan and limited access for oil and gas leasing on the Shoshone National Forest out of concern of the impacts. Mining has long been a part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Particularly above Cook City, and in the 1990s, early 90s, Noranda announced plans to revive the New World mining district in that area. It prompted both litigation and both local and national political opposition that eventually brought President Clinton out here to intervene and in essence to protect Yellowstone National Park from potential implications of large-scale gold mining activity in that location. I think this demonstrates the national significance of the park and of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem itself. Today, or in the last couple of years, we've seen renewed interest in mining, particularly north of the park in Immigrant Canyon and in the Crevice area. It's prompted litigation again. It prompted both a Republican and a Democratic Secretary of the Interior to withdraw federal lands in the area from future mining activity, and eventually Congress weighed in and passed the Yellowstone Gateway Protection Act, again demonstrating the power of Yellowstone Park and the evolving local economy and a strong commitment to protect in this area. We do see mining in another part of the ecosystem in the southwest corner. Phosphate mining in the Caribou National Forest covers roughly 50,000 acres. Concern about water pollution from selenium in the streams. Efforts in court and otherwise to curb this mining activity have not succeeded. I think reflecting the local importance, economic importance of the mines in that area. The area is already heavily industrialized. It's become essentially a sort of sacrifice zone, similar perhaps to the Papa Pinedale Anticline area. A lesson I think we can take from both of those experiences at the edges of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The GYE concept and ecosystem management concerns are less resonant. That powerful local economic concerns can and do often carry the day. Wilderness is an important component of the GYE concept. It's the most protective designation that Congress can grant. It's a political decision whether or not to create wilderness. There's roughly 7 million acres protected as wilderness in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Much of it is adjacent to the two national parks. The map on the screen with the dark green illustrates the presence of designated wilderness lands. The principal areas unprotected are largely on the west side and northwest corner of Yellowstone and Grand Teton of Yellowstone National Park, excuse me. Wilderness principally plays to recreation and conservation, but what's fascinating to me is that given the sort of wilderness heritage that underlies this region and in many ways the GYE concept, there's been no new wilderness designated here since 1984 when the Wyoming Wilderness Act was passed. There are approximately 2 million acres currently eligible for wilderness designation as WSA's wilderness study areas. Been several efforts, major efforts involving both agencies and conservation groups and others to designate wilderness. They've all failed up until this point. To get the congressional designation of wilderness, I should say, an initiative involving the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest. Some of you may be familiar with the recent failed Wyoming Public Lands Initiative. Interestingly, recent forest plans generally do not recommend substantial new wilderness designation. The Shoshone Plan issued a few years ago recommended no new wilderness. All of that said, though, During the Clinton presidency, the Forest Service adopted a roadless rule, and it applies here in the GYE and actually protects, although not quite as stringently, substantial acreage on the national forest. So administratively, wilderness-like protection has been extended, but we haven't seen Congress active in the area. The major controversy that's festering at the moment involves efforts in that stretch of the Gallatin, what was the Gallatin, now the Custer-Gallatin National Forest, between the northwest corner of Yellowstone running almost up to Bozeman, often referred to as the Gallatin Crest, or also the highlight Porcupine Buffalo Horn Wilderness Study Area to gain wilderness protection for the wilderness study areas that were originally designated back in the 1970s. The principal issue at the moment seems to be over pure wilderness versus special management areas that would include space for things like mountain bikes and some off-road vehicle activity, a variety of competing proposals from different collaborative groups or groups involving motorized groups, scientists, recreation groups, conservation groups, etc. The draft, soon to be final, I understand, Gallatin Forest Plan calls for or proposes wilderness designation on approximately 77,000 acres out of the 155,000 acres in the wilderness study area, and would take advantage of backcountry and recreation emphasis areas. Significantly, the plan also provides for no new roads or other extractive activities. It really demonstrates, I think, despite the controversy over exactly how to protect these lands, I think it really demonstrates the extent to which recreation, wildlife, conservation, and wilderness ideas have displaced the traditional extractive activities on the GYE National Forest and become a central focal point of controversy. Backcountry recreation is a continuing concern. By and large, wilderness study areas have been protected by the courts from activities that, motorized, mechanized activities that were not prevailing at the time of the creation of the wilderness study areas. And we've seen court decisions limiting ORVs, snowmobiles, helicopter skiing, and those sorts of activities on wilderness study areas. Similar conflicts prevail on the multiple use lands. The standard governing them, though, is considerably less rigorous. The underlying question is whether these types of activities present, quote, considerable adverse effects. And we've seen some litigation over this type of activity. Let me change gears into the final sort of segment of the talk. We've talked about public lands, wildlife conservation. 30 years ago, private lands really rarely entered the conversation. Conservation efforts were focused on the public lands, but since then, we've seen really explosive population growth in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, particularly most recently during the pandemic. We've seen the loss of open space and important habitat because of development on private lands located at lower elevations in riparian zones, conversion from large ranches to subdivision brings people, roads, fences, dogs that impact wildlife. But the three greater Yellowstone states have largely resisted strong land use regulation in order to protect property rights. Ranching in this area seems to be in transition. Large ranches still persist. They provide open space and habitat, but many of them are changing hands. Some to developers for subdivision, others to amenity buyers. Conservation easements are being used by conservation organizations to try to secure protection. Those are voluntary person-to-person transactions driven by market and other sorts of considerations. But we also have remaining traditional ranchers who use the public lands for livestock grazing. And here, some of the problems of the extensive or the restoration of wolves, the recovery of grizzly bears come into play, where we have conflicts with predators, particularly most recently in the Upper Green River area here in Wyoming. This has prompted grazing allotment buyouts by some conservation organization, particular focus on sheep allotments. The conservation organizations are making use of the market rather than regulatory efforts to address this conservation issue. More than 1 million acres have been retired by both government and non-governmental organization buyout programs. It's reducing conflict between predators and livestock, but not eliminating it at this juncture. A particularly interesting initiative involving private land conservation is taking place northwest of Yellowstone National Park in an area known as the High Divide. Collaborative effort involving both agencies and non-governmental organizations is occurring. It's an innovative effort that involves both public and private lands. The underlying conservation goal is to connect the greater Yellowstone ecosystem with the crown of the continent to facilitate wildlife movement, including grizzly bears, to promote genetic connectivity, to address potential implications of climate change, and it's making some significant headway. Over 750,000 acres have been come under conservation easement on the private lands, and the public agency, the Forest Service in particular, also the BLM, have been, if you will, moving in a similar type of direction to try to identify and protect potential corridors that would protect and enable movement of wildlife, particularly as the climate warms and more habitat or different habitat is needed. But where do we get the money to continue this effort? We need to solidify funding sources. The important point in the larger sense, I think, is that this is an example of collaborative landscape level conservation, thinking beyond the 20 million acre boundary of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem into the broader landscape and opportunities to connect with the ecosystems to the north through the central Idaho wilderness areas, and at the end of the day represents a further expansion of the GYE concept and the continuing need for coordination and collaboration, both at the public and the private level. The maps up there illustrate the High Divide area and where the efforts to connect are taking place. So where does that leave us? So during the last 30 years, the primary threats on the national forests, timber, energy in the GYE, that is, have mostly not come to pass. Wildlife populations generally in pretty good condition, although certainly habitat concerns remain for several species. As I mentioned, no new formal wilderness designation, but yet we have protections extended, similar type protections through the Wyoming Range Act, the National Forest Roadless Rule. The Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee during this period of time has basically validated the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and ecosystem management concepts, but interagency and interjurisdictional coordination is still evolving. There's room to improve. The change that has occurred, interestingly, going back to the vision effort in the late 80s, early 90s, has not been through some sort of comprehensive plan or effort for the GYE. Instead, it's really occurred issue by issue, piecemeal change, if you will. That also reflects the sort of jurisdictional fragmentation that we see on the landscape. Here, think the separate efforts to recover the wolves, to recover the grizzly bears, the bison efforts, et cetera, et cetera. The concept of a greater Yellowstone ecosystem is generally embraced around the area now and within the agencies, and as the High Divide suggests, it's being expanded to a landscape scale, but ecosystem management is still a work in progress. Forces at work, there are several. Demographic and land use changes, also economic changes within the region. You've all witnessed all of this occurring, and it is ongoing, and it's significant in terms of its implications for management and conservation. We've seen evolutionary change within the agencies. Scientists have played a role. They validated the concept and underlying conservation concepts that are being put in place piecemeal again here. Federal law has played a role along with litigation in promoting a vibrant conservation agenda, but at the end of the day, it's politics that really play a major role both on the federal public lands and off of them, and with respect to wildlife. So where are we headed? My thoughts. The GYE is serving as a unifying regional identity, but there's still a lot of jurisdictional complexity that remains a barrier to meaningful coordination. We continue to need movement toward an ecological management approach, a coordinated one. There are new threats on the horizon that are here. Visitation, recreation, wildlife disease, climate change, all pose new significant threats for this area as well as many other areas across the West. And add to that private land development and habitat fragmentation that comes with that. We see a need, I think, to embrace the emerging notion of landscape scale conservation and connectivity through corridors and otherwise. State law, I think this is important, is assuming greater importance in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And that's particularly true with respect to wildlife. It's only the grizzly bear among the major species here that continues to enjoy federal protection. And it also is true in terms of oversight of private lands and development on private lands. We need to improve coordination across the board, the federal level, federal, state, and within the states. I suspect that we're going to continue to see change on a piecemeal basis with respect to conservation, and I think we'll continue to see conflicts being addressed both at the local level and the national level, given the prominence of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And I think we're all eager to see what's next on the horizon. So thank you for your attention. I apologize if I went a little longer than intended, but I wanted to try to get into these issues and provide some of the complexity underlying them. Perhaps it's fitting to end with this John Muir quote: "When one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world." Thanks.